Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Lisa, thanks a million for taking time today to join me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, as we were saying before we hit record, I really appreciate the fact that you've had a whirlwind weekend, coming back from the United States, having multiple canceled flights and all those good things. And now as we're recording kindly giving time and effort to something on only a few hours of sleep in the last 2-3 days. So
Hopefully I'll be
super kind of you.
coherent. Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
That'll be the caveat at the beginning. If anything crazy happens, no, I'm teasing. But appreciate you, Lisa. And appreciate you being here. And I would love to just dive in for our listeners who have, maybe have heard of you or are familiar with some of your global missions work. Maybe for listeners who are like, I don't know what Lisa does or what she's about or what God's called her to do. And I know that, for me, you have a fascinating story. It includes your family's decision to move from South Korea to Canada before you were born, and currently involves you working with Rick Warren as the global strategist for finishing the task, which there's so much between those two things. But I wonder, could you give our listeners just like an overview to say, this is what prompted my family to make that really big move. And this is how God captivated my heart while I was growing up and has called me into this field and why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just, in Isaiah 54, where the Lord says, my thoughts are not your thoughts and my ways are not your ways. And I just look at my own life and the life of my parents and the life of so many of other leaders and just believers, and I'm kind of like, nobody's life turns out the way they thought it would. And sometimes it's hard, but ultimately I do feel like it's good in the fullest sense of the word. It's not just trivial good, like a good piece of cake. It's like deep in your gut good because it's formed you, like the challenges have stretched you and the limits of your heart. You run into that brick wall and God somehow helps you break it down through some of the hard moments. And my parents, they were like, my mom was in her early 20s, my dad, probably late 20s, early 30s, when they came over to Canada. They did not know a single word of English, and Korea was going through some hard times. They're not the economic power that they are now. And, IT technology, Samsung, LG, all that stuff, it was just not the same country. And they had come over for better opportunities. And I think it was just their equivalent of, I will show you a land and you will go. And they came and they endured a lot of the difficulties, including discrimination. And some of it was very innocent. You just don't know when a certain culture and what is a faux pas and whatnot. And there was a lot of loneliness. And then my older brother was born and I was born. We were both born and raised in Toronto. And I just remember them being very intent on raising us with godly principles, regardless of how difficult, things might have been in terms of finances or marriage or just getting a job. They were very intent in raising us with godly principles, to trust God, to be faithful. And we grew up in the church. And if you had told me when I was a kid that I would be working with Rick Warren, I would first have been like, who's Rick Warren? We have our own Korean diaspora circle. And then when he wrote the book, The Purpose Driven Life, then you kind of knew of him because it was translated in Korean and it picked up a lot of readers in the Korean language and the peninsula as well. But I never knew him personally. And so that growing up in the church, in the Korean church, especially just being around missions a lot, the Korean churches were very dedicated to missions, especially the church that I grew up in. My parents had gone to Central Asia after the Soviet Union had fallen apart just to do missions there. We were always talking about it. When I went into the ministry, was involved in Korean diaspora churches that were always somehow involved in missions. So I grew up with it, just thinking that it was what churches did and assumed that it was. And I consider it a very blessed environment that I grew up in. Little did I know that all the senior pastors in the churches that I either grew up in or served in, their history was that they were Campus Crusade guys, like Korean Campus Crusade guys. So they were always about evangelism, reaching the unreached, and just always missions. And that just kind of trickled down and created the church cultures that I was brought up in and where I served. And so after I had left the Korean diaspora church, left the pastoral ministry, did some work with the Canadian Bible Society. It wasn't just, it was not the right fit for me. Bible agencies are great. They do such amazing work, but I was getting restless, learned a lot, by the way, about nonprofits. And it was a great experience for me in that respect. But when I went down to Saddleback Church, they were hosting the Finishing the Task conference. This was December 2019. I had, had some relationship with them, doing some seminars for them about engaging the millennials and the younger generations. But after that conference, I was hosting it for them, emceeing. Mike Constance, who is a global peace pastor from the mission department, he asked me if I would consider coming on board with Finishing the Task. And I was like, but something about that offer just compelled you. And I didn't want to respond right away. So I went back and mulled over it, but I was like, no, this is it. Like, I can feel it in my bones. And so right before the COVID kind of disrupted the entire world, March 2020, I was down there and I officially joined the team thinking that I was going to move down there, but then just didn't happen. I remember that conversation, like, okay, so we'll see you in 3 weeks. And it was like, no, you won't.
No, more like 3 years. Yeah.
Right. And so it was doing a lot of that work, a lot of pivoting for so many people, not just in the religious sector, but everybody's pivoting. Like, what does this look like in this new pandemic, reality? And so I didn't end up moving down then, but continued on as their global strategist. And then there was a couple of shiftings along the way. So I kind of shifted a little bit to the mission team and was doing their unreached, unreached people group initiative through the mission team. And then now rejoining Pastor Rick Warren as part of his core team for Finishing the Task in this new different iteration post-COVID, right?
Yeah.
And so that I'm really excited about that and what is on the horizon. And it just feels like something new, like we're co-creating something in this really different world where people have realized both the urgency of the gospel, but also the limits of who we are, and maybe re-examining what church could be and should be in light of what we all went through together. So that's kind of like how I ended up right now back with Finishing the Task. And I kind of you do one of those moments, right? You look back on your life and you see all these moments where God was just preparing you for this. Again, just growing up in the diaspora church, which was very heavily mission focused, being able to serve out in South Korea for 3 years, in Singapore, and just being exposed to the regions of the world that I may not have had the opportunity to explore if I was just in Canada and just on the Western Hemisphere. So grateful for all of that, and all the short-term mission trips to partners that we had connected with, in India and Southeast Asia and Haiti, Latin America, all those trips that I was able to take. It was a real privilege through the Korean diaspora networks. I just feel like the Lord has this sovereign ability to pull the threads together in your life if we would only let him. If we would only let him. And I just feel that this is a significant moment in my personal life where he's just pulling all those threads together. And I kick against the goads sometimes. Let's not pretend that I don't, but you just, again, have to allow him to do that. And sometimes it's scary because you don't see how it's all going to fit together, but you're just like, I'm just here and I'm just me. And you learn to continue to re-give it up to God, even your own dreams, because they could be good dreams, but it might not be the one that God has for you. And that's always a hard struggle.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. So true. And thank you for that, because if we had more time, there's so much you said, whether it be your parents' experience coming to Canada, your own journey into what you're doing now, and your discovery of considering, different iterations of the church going forward. But, you talked about seeing God prepare you through different experiences for what you're doing now. And I wanted to ask, can you point to along the way, Lisa, either a moment of failure or even just experience of real adversity,
Mm-hmm.
challenge,
Mm-hmm.
that at the time you were just like, this is brutal. But you realize in hindsight, this is actually integral for equipping me for what I'm doing today.
Oh, 100%. So I'm a I'm just gonna call it like it is. I'm a good Asian kid, you know. I love school. I'm very academically focused. Like I was not content with an A minus. Like for
Mm,
myself, that's just how I'm wired. And it just kind of fit into a lot of the expectations that first generation Asian parents, Korean parents have of their kids. And so my mom was like,
wow.
man, I
Yeah.
just remember a time telling you that hey, a B plus is okay because I was so intense, right?
Mm,
Overly intense for
mm,
myself. And so if you asked me in my teenager and early 20s what I wanted to do, it was like, I'm going to go to an Ivy League school, get my PhD, and just kind of go down, for me, very specifically, the Old Testament track. I wanted to do, write
okay.
commentaries. I wanted to be an academic. That was my goal. God had gifted me this way. That was the only way that I could conceive of doing this. And so after I graduated from Gordon Conwell, I did do a year at Harvard's Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations department, and it was harder than it should have been. Like,
Mm,
given how brilliant I am academically, I was just not getting the marks that I was used to. And I thought it was a huge failure. I was like, what is
mm,
wrong with me? I need to push through this. And in the same time, I had gotten an invitation to serve out at Onuri Church in South Korea. And I was like, no, I'm not giving up Harvard just to go to a land that my parents left. I felt more affinity with Canada than I did with South Korea because I was born, raised, educated. I spoke Korean, loved the food, but it was like, those are not my people kind of thing. Like, I don't
wow.
have to go back there. The senior pastor then, he's since passed away, but he's the founder of the church as well. And his name is Reverend Hayongjo Moksanim. He had asked me 3 times and I said no. On the
Mm,
third time, he said, why don't you come out here and explore it? And if you say no while you're out here, then that's it. I won't ask you. Clearly, you're not being moved in that sense. But I remember it was such a huge struggle. And I was like, you know what? It's a free trip to Korea, yada, yada, what you're trying to talk yourself into that. And so I remember being out there for a week and a half or so. And I just knew that God wanted me to leave Harvard. And it was the hardest thing. It was the
mm,
hardest thing. I had reached like my dream school. If I wasn't going to go in there for medical or law, because those were my other 2 options, because I felt really called to the ministry at a young age, then I was going to go to an Ivy League school for something. And it was going to
mm,
be for Old Testament studies. And when that story or that narrative that I created in my mind took a weird left turn from an invitation from a senior pastor that I did not know anything about, going to a land that I did not want to go to. It
mm,
was it was like everything inside of me, all my dreams were gutted. I considered it a failure. I thought it was because maybe I couldn't get the marks at Harvard that this
mm,
was happening to me. Um, and when I went out there, that 3 years with Onuri Church was the changing of my trajectory from something that was more, I thought, again, an academic ministry to something that was very much more about generational continuity in the diaspora church, but also about missions. And it would not have happened if I had dug in my heels and I'm just going to push through and to do my PhD at Harvard. That was a very significant failure in my eyes back then, but a God moment where he just, his hand, his very loving, disciplined hand just said, no, we're going to change that for you. And that was huge for me.
mm.
Um, when I think about adversarial moments, I think there in my whole life, because of the culture that I was brought up in, I think just I still have to do this conversation in my brain about what does it mean to be a female in
Yeah.
the church. And some traditions are very open about it and some are less so. I come from a culture that is much more patriarchal than it is, gender equality, and they have very clear gender roles. It's based on Confucian ideology. When you get out into the Western world for the diaspora people, it's less pronounced, but it
Mm,
still undergirds, people's world views. And to navigate that has been interesting.
mm,
And I wouldn't say that people are adversarial. So much of it's an ongoing conversation and there are challenges because people are very I think when you believe in something that it's a theological truth, I think we do have to recognize and respect that they are doing their best to stand on their convictions. And I would not want somebody to go against their conscience as they understand it before God. But there are conversations to be had about this, and we're still having them. And so that is a consistent conversation. It's a dialogue, and some days it's easier than others. So that's been kind of like a consistent, I won't say a thorn in my side, because it's more like, how do we approach this? And I was just speaking at Biola the other week when I was in California, and one of the things I shared was, it's a theological question for so many people, women in leadership. I mean, how high can they go in the ecclesiology and stuff like that? But for women, it's an existential question. It's not just a theological one. And that's why we feel the tension and the frustration in our being, because God gives you certain talents or certain vision or certain desire, but you've got this whole system and theology and doctrine and history just telling that you can. And so it's a real struggle. Like, how do we express this? And so that's why it's been something that's so meaningful to me, and something that I'm committed to dialoguing out, but not alienating people from the conversation either, because when you're angry about it on either side, that doesn't help. And so those are just a couple of things that I think even today, as I'm being formed in these conversations, they continue to equip me for the conversations that are coming next.
Yeah. Lisa, what would you say to the woman listening who feels gifted and called to leadership and is running up against those same challenges?
I would say that it is first of all, depending on the context you're in, it can be very empowering for women, or it could be very stifling. Regardless of the context you're in, I think it is our responsibility as God's daughters to bring our full self to the conversation. So your gender, your ethnicity, your talents, your desires. Now, again, sometimes depending on your interlocutor, you can be much more forceful and much more open about it. But if you know the context you're entering into, then our posture matters a lot in how things that we say are received. And so I know that it's very difficult in many of the situations in many parts of the world, just because, again, their worldviews and their cultural traditions are very different. But it's just this double-edged sword where it does not take away the privilege of women, of God's daughters serving in the church, but it also doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of stepping into your calling. It makes it much more challenging, but I think we're still called to do it. And that's where I think all the wisdom and the, I'm going to say the savvy of navigating those cultural those cultural barriers and minds are very important. And then knowing how to, in our marginalized voices, actually have more influence. And it takes a lot of internal strength. It takes a lot of wisdom. It takes a lot of patience. But for those daughters and those women's and my sisters who are listening, I will say this: I'm confident that the Lord will be the lifter of your head in this life and the next. And God has never not used his daughters, despite the patriarchal systems of the first century Judaic world, or the Old Testament, the ancient Near East. There was always a way that God said, I will use my daughters, whether it was Rahab, whether it was the daughters of Zelophehad, whether it was Lydia, he's always used them. I don't know that God is such so stuck on gender in the way that we have been in this conversation. I think he uses who's available. And so as long as you are available, there will be a way that he will lift your head and he will create those platforms for you. And I always think back to the story of Esther, where, she's queen consort, but Persian power politics, that is a realm of men. And Haman had the ear of the king then. And he had just dominated the court so much that it was literally impossible for any other man to kind of penetrate the king's ear and just to show him what kind of maniacal character Haman really was. It took a woman to do backdoor kind of entry into the politics and her femininity, and she outmaneuvered Haman, and she was the one who saved her people. So there are circumstances where literally being a male is a liability, despite the fact that there's position and power. And God used Esther, and she is the Christ figure in that story and still celebrated. in the Jewish culture as well as the Christian culture. And so there's something to that story that is exciting for me, to challenge our young women. There's always a way. And when God has called you, how we do it matters. Because again, it just breaks my heart a little bit when this conversation about women leadership threatens to divide the church. Because now for me, we're playing into the hands of the enemy. And so how do we maintain the conversation, empower our women, despite the fact that we are having this conversation? And maybe the onus is upon us in our posture, and that's not ideal. But for me, at least where I stand as a female, I don't want to be the one that divides the church. So how can I carry myself without becoming a doormat? How can I carry myself in a way that demonstrates leadership, humility, servant leadership, that I am capable, that God has gifted me with that, and win people over who may not have been on the same side of the debate or the conversation as I have been. But it's the long game for me. I don't want to alienate any one of my brothers or sisters, because there are many women who still believe in the complementarian stance. That's fine. That's not the end game for me. But how do we work together for the Great Commission? How do we get this message of the gospel to everybody? Because certainly we can work together. Certainly we can work together on this, right? So.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Lisa. I wonder, for you, having that experience serving in Korea, growing up in Canada, serving now in the United States, you've had a unique front row seat to what God is doing internationally, as well as, in North America. And there's a lot of statistics that indicate that the evangelical church, specifically in North America, is pretty rapidly in decline, and that it seems that the global center of the evangelical church is rapidly growing in places like South America and parts of Africa. And so I wonder, could you speak to, why do you think that is? What's causing that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I remember even in seminary, and I'm going to date myself here, which was like in 2003 to 2006. People had been talking already in our missions classes, world missions classes. They were already talking about the shift of Christianity from the Western Hemisphere, the global North, to the global South. Already. And that, I think that was even a decade into that conversation. So missiologists have observed this trend for several decades now, and we're just seeing it really come to fruition. And I think that there's something to be said for how the Spirit moves according to, and how God moves according to the availability, the resilience, the response, that's the word I'm looking for, of the people. And these days I keep on thinking back to the parable of the soils, in Luke 8, where it talks about, the path, and the gospel is said, and it's just people's hearts are hard. So it's just going to be picked away by the birds. And then there's the rocky ground, and there's the thorns, and then there's the good soil. I just wonder if, for some reason, and our choices are part of this. Well, our choices as a community, not individual choices, but as a country, as a culture, in many of the established, we're going to call first world countries that are, established. We have a certain level of wealth, a certain level of geopolitical status, if we can put it that way. I wonder how good our soil is in terms of gospel receptivity. Wow, and so I wonder if, we have somehow cultivated a rocky ground where we receive the word, but there's no root, there's no opportunity for us to go really deep, and I wonder if this is the other one that concerns me more, about the thorns, where, the seeds are growing and stuff, but then all the troubles and all the pleasures and all the distraction, the temptations, they just kind of take away everything. Yeah. Everyone's only got 24 hours. That's it. And we fill it with all these things that are culture. I put them as I word them as cultural set pieces that we think we have to do. And then God gets the 2 hours on a Sunday. And we wonder why discipleship is not flourishing in a setting like North America, where, we have all these things that we have to do in order to fit in with the cultural lifestyle, the Canadian dream, the American dream. And these are just things that we take for granted, that of course, this is what life is. But then I wonder if that has taken precedent over what we're actually called to do, which is share the gospel. and to consider the global plight of the world. And when you look at some of the nations where the Lord is moving, like in the continent of Africa is just booming, charismatic, the charismatic tradition is growing as well. And in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, there's something to be said for having nothing. You know, being in nations that are continuing to develop and grow economically, and on the, you know, they're not at the top of the geopolitical statuses and all that stuff. There's something to be said for the church in its rawest forms. And I think institutionalizing a church, it can be helpful because you can't have chaos all the time, but something about institutionalizing it to the point that it's just stagnant. And I wonder if that's what's happened in the North American church, like the denominationalism, if I can put it that way, and just the religious culture that is set in rather than deep spirituality. And I've been talking to my peers in North America, and there is this thirst, this desire to re-engage with spirituality. And we saw what happened in Asbury. The young people who were just like, you know, that they're calling it a revival, where there was just days and days of just prayer and coming back to God. And you wonder if we've kind of starved the North American church out of that because we've made it so corporate, or we've institutionalized it so much. And so that, when I look at the decline of Christianity or spirituality in the Western Hemisphere, I wonder if it's because we haven't cultivated the good soil. We haven't done that hard work because we've just taken it for granted. And anyone who's a farmer knows that you can have a great crop one year, but if you don't do something to till the soil and to make it healthy for the next crop, it's just, you might get a decent crop the next year, but it's going to get harder and harder to do so in the subsequent years. And I wonder if that's what's happened with us here.
Great insights. Well, I wonder, you know, speaking about the global South, and there can be complex histories in certain countries. I think maybe more of South America and some of the situations related to the Catholic Church and the marriage of church and state historically. And I know that oftentimes there's an accusation that's brought against the missional efforts of Western nations, or even nations in Western Europe, like England, for example, that have actively sent missionaries or people in ministry to train Christ followers in countries that haven't maybe necessarily been historically Christian, where people have pushed back and said, you know, this is wrong. This is colonialism dressed up in religious garb. This is just an act that's hurting culture or destroying language or what have you. And there's some complex realities there. But how would you, when people say the modern missions movement has ultimately been a travesty, how would you respond to that kind of critique?
I think we have to, first of all, own it. Like it's not been great in many parts of the world. Like you said, there was a marriage between church and state, and you can just so blatantly see it in some of the historical narratives where it was not about sharing the love of Jesus Christ. It was about getting wealth, about land, about power, rather than serving the people and winning them over to Christ. It was about conversion, literally at gunpoint or sword point. It was about dominating a land and a people, rather than it was to win them over to the kingdom of God, and appreciating the beautiful cultures that God had given to them. Like they might not be believing people at one point, but they are still made in the image of God. And the beautiful cultures that are around, and let's just put it out there, our culture is also corrupted. But there are such beautiful elements in all the cultures out there that for me is a reflection of the creative God. You know, there's such beauty in the music and the food and the colors, in the colors of all the cultures. There's such beauty there. And for the church to have demeaned it and to have destroyed it in the name of Christ, I think there was something very wrong there. And in Canada, we're reckoning with it with our Indigenous communities. And there's something that we do need to reckon for. And so I think we need to own it. And the harder part was, and this is again in some of the discussions that are coming up in Canadian history, it was the cover up that was like adding a lot of insult to injury and more injury to the insult. Like the church just did not, when they knew it was wrong, there was an effort to try to change the narrative to a little bit too much, so that it's literally you're changing the story of how it happened. And that's where I think some of the phrases that we might be uncomfortable with comes up, like, that's your truth and my truth. And we're believers who have, there's an absolute truth that I believe that there is a God. I believe that there's good and there is evil. But you have to understand, when people are saying that it's my truth, it's a little bit more nuanced than saying that it's all relativism. They're saying that my experience and what the official narrative is very different. So how do we reconcile it so that we get the full picture from those who are oppressed and who are the oppressors, and without trying to rehash all of history, because we can't undo it. That's the other thing that is so frustrating about this. We look at history, we look at the things at the churches, and we can't undo it. But how do we move forward from here? And to some of the critics and the critiques out there, I would say it wasn't all bad. It really wasn't. And I look to the peninsula, the Korean peninsula, just to point out that, yes, they reinforce some traditional values for sure. But it was Christian missionaries like Appenzeller and Underwood that brought medicine, that really changed a lot of villages and brought modern medicine in. And that's where we need to be honest with, how can we do better as we move forward? That's a real conversation in finishing the task. We don't want it west to the rest. What did we do in history to give this impression to the rest of the world that Jesus Christ and God is a Western God? My goodness, he's not. He's a Middle Eastern. He came in the form of a Middle Eastern man. And so for us to kind of hijack that narrative kind of did us a real disservice. And so that's where it's kind of like, how do we actually tell this narrative? And so I know that there's a great effort in trying to rediscover the historical part of Jesus, the man part of Jesus, who was, again, born in Palestine, and he was a carpenter, and he looked a certain way. He wasn't the Europeanized, Renaissance painting version of Jesus. He was just, he fit into the Middle Eastern culture. And so to recognize the realness of that, I think, is an important part of how we kind of say that God is not a Western God. We are as privileged to receive the gospel, but we haven't always done it in a great way. And I think it would be important, like Hudson Taylor, Adoniram Judson, William Carey, there's some of the Eric Liddell, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, some of the better ones, but man, they weren't recognized in their day and age. It was an afterthought that they were. We look back on their lives and we see that their testimony was demonstrated in their life. A long life, and there was a lot of suffering, and they never wanted to be accoladed for themselves. It really was, hey, how do we be Christ to the people around us? And we haven't always been successful. And I think that's where history has come to, we are reckoning with it, and we should not shy away from that. And so these are some tough conversations, but that's where I think I've always believed that diversity and generational continuity are built in the kingdom of God. So if we're going to have honest conversations about what colonialism looked like in India, let the Indian brothers and sisters speak into that. How can we learn, right? There are great partners out there who are serving their own people groups. They've been through it, and they love Jesus. And so we need to learn. There needs to be a humble posture about how we overcome some of the challenges that we've set in place for ourselves. Like, and I say this as a Christian, and I'm not a Western colonial person, but when I am born and raised in Canada and I say I'm Christian, it's part of for me at least, this is how I approach it. I'm not saying that everybody has to approach it this way, but I'm like, yeah, no, I need to own some of that. I wasn't the perpetrator. But I need to somehow be part of the conversation as an apologetic, to say that, yeah, do you know what? I'm a minority Christian female. I know that the Christians haven't always done good, but my goodness, Jesus Christ, he's the real deal. Christians, no, we are flawed. Our history is very flawed, but I am going to do my best to try to be Christ. And how do I speak into this conversation that needs, honestly, if we're going to overcome this West to the rest perspective and this colonialism, church, you need more voices. You need to have more voices from different backgrounds and different worldviews to help us in this conversation to fill it out in a better way, because it's not been done well. That's not to say that it hasn't been tried, but it's just not been done well. And I think that when we get the backlash or just the critiques about it, that's evidence that it hasn't been done well, maybe not compassionately enough. We haven't listened enough to the world that we want to so love as God so loved us.
So on that note, I mean, you mentioned some of those names like Bonhoeffer and Little and Taylor and Judson and others. So to double click on that, what does it look like then now in the 21st century for the people of God to embrace that kind of spirit-filled, scripturally sound, and long-standing sustainable approach to seeing God's kingdom come in our world in a way that's devoid of some of those historic hangups of grasping for power or resources,
Yeah.
status or control?
So this is hard even for me, right? I always go back to Jesus and to Paul. And so
Mm,
for Jesus, as we get into, Passion Week soon and stuff like that, and the Easter season, like he said nothing. It was just silent when the world and the leaders were so angry and like goading him on to say something, say that you're the Son of Man, and bring all these angels down. And he says that in the garden as he's leaving. If you when Peter cuts off the ear, it's like, you don't think that I can call legions of angels? I can. But this
yeah.
restraint,
Mm,
and that to me demonstrates that he's God. He doesn't have to lord it over people, right?
yeah.
And then that coupled with what Paul writes in Philippians, I lay down my rights, consider others better than yourselves, and he goes about the example of Christ who poured himself out until he became nothing. And I'm like, so for example, in this conversation about women leaders, like what is the right posture? And when Jesus gives up his rights that he's entitled to, and Paul writes about giving up his rights, maybe the way to win people over in this world is actually not all about fighting for your rights, which is so anathema in a world, in a culture where it's like, we got to fight for this right, that right, your rights, your voice, and all this stuff. And I'm not saying that you should be a doormat, but I struggle with, what does it look like in how I carry myself to lay down your rights for your enemies,
Mm,
for people who have hurt you? It's not easy, but maybe that's the way that we win over an unbelieving world. And I look at someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who went back to Germany and he didn't have to, because he was like, that's my country, that's my people. And if I can't go back and be present and suffer alongside, how can I critique them? That's
mm,
just blows your mind. He was on the last ship back over to Europe before everything like imploded. And,
mm,
and he was in the concentration camp. And Eric Little, who died in the Japanese concentration camp in China while he was
yeah.
missionary there. It's just like, he was a world-class athlete.
Mm,
And to lay that down, everyone would think you're crazy. Why can't you be a Christian athlete and be influential in that sense? But he felt deeply called to the people of China.
yeah.
And I'm just like, maybe that's the secret for real believers. What does it look like to lay down our rights in a world that says fight for your rights,
Yeah.
right? And it's such a conundrum for me, because you don't want to be a doormat, but how many people, Peter included, may have thought that Jesus was a doormat for not asserting himself when he could have.
Yeah.
And yet if he did, he would not have died on the cross. And what will we do with our sin? And so that's a struggle for me, because there are days like, how when I just have the perfect thing to say to this person right now. And it's like, am I now asserting myself and
Mm,
my will to power, my desire to be right in this theological debate? And so I struggle with that too, on a real level, on a day to day. And I think about the work that needs to be done on the mission field, the least reached, the hardest to reach countries. What's the way to win them over?
mm.
Laying down our rights until the point of death, like death on a cross. Um, I mean, Jesus Christ, he taught that too. It's not easy. You have to lay down your lives, you pick up your cross and you follow me. And how many of us have actually done that? Before I challenge anyone else, I want everyone to know that I really struggle with this on certain days, and maybe every day I should. Because again, what does it look like to lay down your life daily? What does it look like to take up your cross daily? And so,
And how might that be the primary window that God uses to invite the world to see the heart of Jesus?
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I'm so grateful that you're willing to honestly wrestle with that, because I know a big part of what you're passionate about is seeing future generations considering what God's call is on their life, how
Mhm.
they embrace the message of the gospel and partner with the mission of God in their local context and internationally as well. And it's not easy. It's a pretty high
Mhm.
and challenging calling. And so I love that we've just been wrestling with that together here on this podcast, because I'd love to know, when you're looking at Gen Z, for example, people born since the year 2000 who are just starting to, the oldest ones, complete university and step into the workforce, and a generation that is their digital natives, and a generation that has seen uh, a lot take place on the world stage, whether it be 9/11 right at the beginning of this generation, or
Mm.
more recent conflict in Western Europe, or the pandemic. There's been some real moments of upheaval. And so when you think about the need for the gospel in our world today, and also the potential of that next generation, how are you saying this is how we galvanize this next generation around the message of the gospel and the mission of the church to make a difference in the world?
Mhm, mhm, for sure. For me, I always start with the fact that, okay, God is sovereign. Okay.
Mm,
And he has birthed this Gen Z generation to be young adults in this day and age. So
mm,
he's not wrong about that. And so when I go into that mind frame, I'm like, obviously, okay, I'm in my 40s in 2023. Okay. And so it's like, I am at a certain stage of life, and these young adults, these leaders are in a certain stage of life. So they're the ones that God has chosen to kind of like close out the 21st century and lay the foundations for this 22nd century just by human lifespan. And so when I recognize that, I look at them like we cannot dumb them down.
mm,
They are the ones that God has chosen. So how do we help them lean into all the potential that God sees in them? And they have the same spirit of God that was given to us at Pentecost, that Paul, laid claim to, that you and I laid claim to. So I don't think that, I actually am very hopeful for the next generation. I see them and I'm like, okay, so it's you. It is you that is going to navigate this digital world, this chaotic world where these cultural questions are coming up. I feel that they are the ones with the answers. They're going to be like the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew how to act. And if they're not there yet, we need to pray for them to get there, and we need to deposit into them all the experiences that we have so that they're the best equipped as possible. And I think there's obedience on their side. But one of the things that we can do to galvanize this generation, I love how you worded that question, galvanizing, is we need to make a clear clarion call. Don't dumb it down for them. Like, I wonder if we word it this way that it'll land better. Like, the call for the church is very clear. Go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to baptize, and obeying all the commands that I've commanded. That needs to be clear. Generation after generation, that has always been what the church has inherited. And the church, let's remember, despite what we see in our immediate vicinity in North America, the church is strong. And the enemy knows this because the church has been given the Holy Spirit. And ever since that moment, I believe that the enemy has always been on the defense.
mm,
And so it's important what you pointed out earlier, that the church is growing in other parts of the world. And so that is a sobering thought, where is the Spirit moving? How do we lean into what God is doing? And how do we not back off from the fight? And so this young generation, just to give them that clear clarion call to say, this is what the mission of the church is. It's always been this way. And seeing how they respond. And then in this day and age where change is so rapid, don't keep them on the outskirts of the leadership conversations, because we're not digital natives, they are. I do believe that they need the wisdom and the life experience, but we need their know-how. Like,
mm.
they're the generate. Like, I remember having to go to the stacks at Robarts Library to do my research. They literally have all the knowledge at the, just type it in, or
Mm.
on their phones. It's literally all there. So they have the know-how now, in the sense of just the pragmatic stuff and just the access to information on their fingertips. Now, what you cannot fast track and microwave is life experience. You can only live 16 years. If you're 16 years old, you can only live 25 years when you're 25 years old. And the wisdom of the older generations, this is where the generational continuity is so significant for me. That principle, in that sense, there is nothing new under the sun. That's Ecclesiastes. it's not saying that the iPhone was invented when Solomon was teaching that. What there is saying that there are human behavioral patterns and cultural things like history repeating itself, that if we can glean from the previous generations, that would inform us of those principles. And the young generation needs to contribute on how now it unfolds in their context. And so for me, I think I'm just excited for this generation. I think we need their help. We need to co-create digital strategies. We need to co-create missional strategies with them in the world that they can navigate so naturally. But what we bring is prayer. What we bring is support. What we bring is what David brought to Solomon, all his political treaties, all his wealth, all the raw materials that Solomon needed to build the temple. David was not the man to do it, but my goodness, he had the resources. So David brings all his resources right up to the line, and it's up to Solomon thereafter to, in obedience, follow through. So we can't force this next generation to obey, but my goodness, we can set them up as best as we can for that obedience and to inspire them into that. And that's a demonstration of faith as well. So not just the resources, but how to demonstrate what it looks like to finish the race well. And I think one of the difficulties that we are going to have to face with the young generation is the sheer number of evangelical leaders that have not run their race completely well until the end. Like, how do we account for that? That's a real thing too. And that is what I think the young generation finds difficult. They're a generation that really resonates with authenticity. And so when you've got a teaching that is true, but a life that does not follow it, they find that dissonance very disillusioning. So how do we now, I don't know, apologetics for that? How do we explain the reality of that life? And how do we do better in terms of setting those examples for them as well? So that's just kind of some of the thoughts when it comes to the next generation. I'm super excited for them.
Well, and for the next generation, especially young people who are thinking strategically and purposefully about the impact of their life, especially if they're living in North America. I mean, we've witnessed in recent decades a huge influx of people immigrating to, well, Canada specifically, in our own experience, from, in some instances, places around the world that are historically pre-Christian, where they've had little to no access to the gospel. And I mean, I was thinking about this because last week I was at, I grew up in Thailand as a missionary kid and was buying something at Shoppers Drug Mart. And the woman, the cashier, was from Thailand. And I'm like, wow, like this is crazy. I can be sharing the gospel with a Thai person without ever leaving the city of Barrie here in Canada. And increasingly, especially in the GTA, that's happening more and more. And so, Lisa, I wonder if you could speak to that place of because there's that element of wanting to galvanize people to say, what might God do in your life internationally? But then there's also the place to say, what might God do through your life, given the fact that someone from India just moved in next door to you, right? Or the person working in the cubicle right next to you is from Uganda, or, I could go on and on. And so in light of that kind of changes in the West, how would you invite listeners to be thinking really purposefully about how God would use them to live on mission in their local context, even as that context becomes rapidly more and more diverse?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was Marshall McLuhan who was like the global village, right? Like literally now the global village, like, and it's so beautiful to be able to walk downtown Toronto and literally hear like 6 different languages.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the great things about our city. And there's so many of these multicultural cities around the world now, and they're growing in multiculturalism. And I loved living in Singapore because that was like Asian multiculturalism, right? Like there was all sorts of Asians there. And sometimes we just kind of say, oh, Asia, and we just kind of like have this one visual, but there's so many people groups in Asia. And Singapore was one of those countries where it was very multiculturally Asian, multi-ethnically Asian. I just loved it. And so one of the things that we have to recognize, and again, this is kind of like, it's both a privilege and I think a responsibility, where there is an upheaval and people move for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's not their choice. Like a lot of people are refugees because of conflict, right? And I think the UNHCR just recently said that there was 103 million people who have been displaced in mid 2022, and by not their choice. Like there's people who immigrate because, they have the money or they have a different job offer, stuff like that. It's their choice. And then there's people, or marriage, right? And then there's people who don't. But what the reality is, you can see the demographics changing from like 5 years ago and even till now. And I just feel like God is bringing the world to us in many ways, right? And that makes us, again, the living generation, whether you're a young person that's living or an old person that's living, doesn't matter. Everyone who's a believer and alive, we are now in the generation that is living that has the least amount of excuse to say we didn't know. Because it's like, okay, well, if you can't go, there are people around you.
Yeah.
And so it's a stunning visual, I think. And I think the church needs to embrace that. And now, how do we come alongside these people who carry in themselves the image of God, and who we are called to share Jesus with as a good neighbor? And in North America, we can go our entire lives without knowing who our neighbors are. It's just a reality of the culture that has been built up. You wave to them or you kind of know them and they move out or they move in. And I think that's where community has become I think a good buzzword, especially with, again, the young generation. They just want to find their people, their tribe, their ride and die. They just want to connect. And I think the internet and the digital social media, all that stuff helps them connect, but they're thirsting for something more, something like community. And so that's one of the things that we're examining right now with some people from Crew and Jesus Film. What does a digital community look like for this generation? How do they really connect? And I think those are significant questions. And when we see like our kids who are friends with, other kids from India or Sri Lanka, or like you said, Uganda or Haiti, and we're picking them up from school or something like that. I mean, like they're just right there, right? Is it that hard to be kind? The worst people can say is, oh no, I'm not interested in coming over for dinner. Oh no, that's okay. But you'll find that people are just people. Like, would you do that to somebody who's so kind? You might, depending on if you're busy or not, but usually when you're just waiting for your kids to come out after school, it's like, hey, what's your name? And you just want to get to know people's stories. And I think that is such a real part of the gift that God gives to us in this life. We have a story. And part of that story is Jesus. You don't have to know the 4 spiritual laws in perfect theological order and all the Bible verses that support every single point. You just need to know your own story, which is pretty easy because you've lived it, and how Jesus impacted you. And that's the story that you share with the person who's standing next to you in the grocery line, while the person ahead of you is like, 10,000 items and you're just stuck there. And you can start off with like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're stuck here. And then you segue into, hey, how many kids do you have? This is why I'm getting all these pizza pots or something like that. It's just people. We're just people who are looking for connection. And I think ultimately every person is looking for the connection with the Almighty, because we're made in his image, and we're all just channels and ways to point people to what they're really looking for, which is eternal life. And isn't that what the Samaritan woman did when she met Jesus? Right. So
that is brilliantly put, Lisa, and a great place for us to land the plane in our time together. But before we do, can I just ask, where can people learn more about you or engage with your work online if they're wanting to take the next step and lead this conversation together?
Yeah, for sure. So finishingthetask.com is where you can learn about finishing the task and what Pastor Rick Warren is kind of heading up and spearheading in this next season of his life. Also saddleback.com, the church, they have a great program that I'm also kind of involved in, which is the peace program. And so you can find out about what it looks like to be a person of peace in your own community, in your nation, and globally as well. And they'll have it all outlined. And, I'm actually pretty open to people contacting me. So if you do have any questions about the ministry about that I do, Lisa at finishingthetask.com, people can reach me there, and I'd be happy to respond as my time allows. And I'm pretty good at emails. So yeah.
I can vouch for that. Absolutely. Well, Lisa, thank you. Thank you for everything you've shared and for just investing through this conversation, and all those that are listening. I'm really, really grateful that we could connect together today.
Thank you for having me.